Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today we're tackling a subject with a serious wow factor, Chinese characters.
It's a fascinating world to unpack, that's for sure. We're talking thousands of years of history, culture, and linguistic evolution.
No kidding, we've got our work cut out for us. From what I've seen, just scratching the surface of this topic is like opening up, like one of those Russian nesting dolls.
That's a great analogy. You keep uncovering these layers of complexity and meaning.
Exactly. So where do we even begin with something as intricate as Chinese characters?
Well, a lot of people assume they're just complex pictures, but that's a huge oversimplification. It's like saying the Great Wall of China is just a long wall, technically true, but it misses the grandeur.
Yeah, I can see that. You can't just sum up something so deeply rooted in history and culture with a simple explanation.
Precisely. There's so much more to it. It's the evolution from simple pictographs to these sophisticated ideograms that truly captures the ingenuity of this writing system.
Okay, so let's rewind for a second. Pictographs, ideograms, these terms might sound a bit like ancient Greek to some of our listeners. Could you break those down for us?
Absolutely. Imagine you're living thousands of years ago with no way to write things down. You might start by drawing pictures of what you see, right? A sun, a tree, a person. Those are your pictographs.
Makes sense, pretty straightforward. But how do you go from drawing a sun to expressing something abstract like bright?
That's where the real magic happens.
Right.
The ancient Chinese developed this brilliant concept called the rebus principle.
Rebus principle. Okay, now you've got my attention.
Essentially, they started using existing characters for their sounds, not just their meanings. So to write bright, which is they combine the characters from sun and moon equals bright. Get it?
Wow, so they were like the original linguistic hackers, finding these clever workarounds to create new meanings.
Exactly. And that's how you go from simple pictures to these intricate symbols capable of expressing incredibly complex ideas.
This is already blowing my mind, and we're just getting started. But it gets even more interesting when you start looking at the structure of these characters.
Oh, absolutely. We've got to talk about radicals. They're like the building blocks of Chinese characters.
Radicals, okay. Are we talking about revolutionaries trying to overthrow the emperor and establish a new calligraphic order? Because that would be a completely different podcast.
Huh. Not quite. Although, now I kind of want to hear that story. No, in this context, radicals are these graphical components, and they're key to understanding the meaning of a character. Think of them like visual clues.
So like a Sherlock Holmes of language, you can use these radicals to decipher the meaning of a character.
Exactly. Let's say you see the water radical, which looks like this. You instantly know the character has something to do with water, like the word for river or lake. They both have that water radical right there.
So it's like having a secret decoder ring for a whole language. That's incredible.
It really is. And it's not just about radicals. You also have what are called phonographs components that give you a hint about the pronunciation. So you're using both visual and phonetic cues to crack the code.
This is already blowing my mind, and we haven't even scratched the surface.
We've only just begun our deep dive. We still have to explore how these characters evolved over time, how they spread across cultures, and even how they've adapted to the digital age.
Well, buckle up, listeners, because this journey is just getting started.
So we've talked about the basic building blocks of Chinese characters, but now let's step back in time to see how these characters actually evolved. Imagine yourself surrounded by fragments of oracle bones etched with the earliest forms of Chinese writing.
Okay, you're really painting a picture here. So we're talking ancient China, way before paper was even a thing. What did they use to write on back then?
Well, before paper came along, they used things like bamboo and silk. Imagine trying to write on those delicate surfaces. It must have taken incredible skill and patience.
It sounds like an art form in itself.
It truly was. And as the writing materials changed, so did the characters themselves. Over centuries, they transformed from those early pictorial forms on the oracle bones to more stylized, fluid scripts.
So it's like a visual evolution, a bit like how handwriting styles have changed over time. But was there ever a push to simplify the characters throughout history?
Oh, absolutely. Even back then, people were looking for ways to make writing easier and faster.
Makes sense. Time is money, even in ancient China.
Right. The Qin dynasty, for instance, they really pushed for standardization, introducing something called the small seal script, which helped streamline the characters. And later, during the Han dynasty, we see the emergence of the clerical script, making the characters even simpler and faster to write.
So it's like they were constantly trying to strike that balance between preserving the essence of these characters and making them more practical for everyday use.
Exactly. It was a constant dance between tradition and innovation.
Speaking of tradition, our research mentions something called the Eight Principles of Young. What exactly is that? Some secret kung fu technique for writing characters with extra flair.
Huh. I love the image. It's not quite kung fu, but it does involve a certain mastery of the brush. The Eight Principles of Young is a calligraphic exercise using the character gri, which means eternity. It teaches 8 fundamental brushstrokes that are essential for beautiful and technically sound Chinese calligraphy.
So it's like learning scales on a piano, mastering the basics before you can compose a masterpiece.
A perfect analogy.
Mhm.
And just like music can transcend borders, Chinese characters also spread their influence far and wide, shaping the writing systems of entire regions.
We're talking about the sinosphere, right? It's always sounded kind of mysterious to me.
It does have a certain ring to it, but it simply refers to the East Asian cultural sphere that was heavily influenced by Chinese culture, especially when it comes to language and writing. Think about countries like Japan, Korea, Vietnam. They all borrowed and adapted Chinese characters to fit their own languages, leading to these fascinating hybrid systems.
Our notes mention terms like kanji, hanja, and chunom. It's like a whole world history lesson, but for writing systems.
It really is. Each of those terms represents a unique example of cultural exchange and adaptation. For instance, take the Japanese word for sword, which is katana, written with the character dek. That same character can also be read as to in other contexts, showing how they added their own layers of meaning to these borrowed symbols.
It's like each character carries this hidden history, these echoes of cultural exchange embedded within its strokes.
Absolutely. And it wasn't just a one-way street. Chinese also borrowed back from these other cultures, adopting words and even adjusting pronunciations based on how they used them. It was a dynamic back and forth of linguistic influence.
A true cultural remix. It makes you realize how interconnected languages really are. But let's fast forward to the present day. How have Chinese characters managed to survive, even thrive, in this digital age? I mean, we're talking about thousands of complex characters versus the QWERTY keyboard.
That's the million-dollar question. It really highlights the clash between tradition and technology. Imagine trying to type out those intricate characters on a standard keyboard. It would take forever.
Oh, I can only imagine. I remember those tiny keyboards on old cell phones. Trying to type anything in another language was a nightmare.
Exactly. So the development of more efficient input methods was crucial for Chinese characters to survive in the digital world. Now you have systems like Pinyin, where you just type the pronunciation using the Roman alphabet, and the computer basically does the rest.
That's so clever. So instead of hunting and pecking for the right character, you just type how it sounds and it magically appears.
Pretty much. But it's not just about phonetic input. You also have stroke-based methods like Wubi and Kangji. They're incredibly ingenious, utilizing the structural logic of the characters themselves. It's like high-speed digital calligraphy.
It really speaks to human ingenuity, finding ways to bring this ancient writing system into the 21st century. But what about the sheer number of characters? How do computers even begin to process all that information?
Well, that's where Unicode comes in. It's a universal character encoding standard that assigns a unique code point to every single Chinese character, allowing them to be displayed and processed by computers worldwide.
So it's like the digital Rosetta Stone breaking down the barriers between different writing systems.
Exactly. And it underlines the fact that Chinese characters are more than just a way to write. They're deeply intertwined with the cultural identity of millions of people.
Which brings us to a topic that sparked quite a bit of debate: simplified versus traditional characters.
Ah, yes, the great character debate. It's a topic with layers of history, culture, and even politics woven into it. But at its core, it's really about balancing tradition with practicality.
So break it down for us. Simplified versus traditional. What's the deal?
Well, at the most basic level, simplified characters are just that, simplified versions of traditional characters. They have fewer strokes, making them quicker and easier to write.
So is it kind of like the difference between cursive and print? They both represent the same letters, but one is a bit faster to jot down.
Yeah, that's a good way to think about it. And this push for simplification really gained traction in the 20th century, especially in mainland China, as a way to boost literacy rates. The idea was, if the characters are easier to learn, more people could become literate, leading to greater participation in society.
It's amazing how something as seemingly simple as a writing system can have such a huge ripple effect. But were these simplified forms completely new inventions, or were they based on something older?
That's a great question. Actually, many simplified characters weren't totally new. They were often rooted in existing shorthand or cursive forms that people had been using informally for ages. A good example is the character for cloud. The traditional form is pretty complex, right? But the simplified form, Ke, streamlines those strokes.
Yeah.
And it's actually closer to how the character looked way back in Oracle Bone script.
So, in some ways, simplification was about going back to the character's roots, to a more streamlined form.
In some cases, yeah. But it wasn't always straightforward. Sometimes simplification meant swapping out complex parts of a character with something simpler, and that could sometimes obscure the original meaning or the elegance of the traditional form.
Ah, I see. It's that classic debate. Do you go for a shorter, more accessible version or the full unedited experience, even if it's a bit more challenging? Kind of like abridged books.
Exactly. And just like with books, there's no right or wrong answer. The choice to use simplified or traditional characters often comes down to personal preference, cultural context, or even political views.
Right. It's not just about which system is easier. It's about cultural identity, history, and how people connect with their language.
You got it. It's a complex issue with no simple answers. But generally speaking, you'll see simplified characters used mainly in mainland China, Malaysia, and Singapore, while traditional characters are more common in Taiwan, Hong Kong, and Macau. But even within those regions, there are people who can read and appreciate both.
It seems like the world of Chinese characters is anything but static, always evolving, adapting, and sparking debate. Which leads us to our final thought-provoking question for today. What's next for these intricate characters in our increasingly digital world?
Ah, the million-dollar question. It's a question with no easy answers, but lots of interesting possibilities to consider. On the one hand, we've got instant translation at our fingertips, the dominance of the Latin alphabet in the digital space, and a huge emphasis on quick communication. It's easy to wonder if Chinese characters, with all their complexity, might get left behind.
So are they destined to become relics of the past, confined to museums and ancient texts?
I don't think so, not at all. In fact, their complexity, their unique beauty, their incredible cultural depth, those might be the very things that save them. In a world that's becoming increasingly uniform, dominated by a handful of global languages, Chinese characters stand out. They have a visual appeal, a connection to history that's just irreplaceable.
It's like the difference between a mass-produced poster and a hand-painted calligraphy scroll. Both are valid, but that scroll, it just has a certain artistry, a soul that you can't replicate.
Precisely. And that artistry, that connection to a rich and vibrant heritage, I think that will continue to resonate with people. We're already seeing a resurgence of interest in Chinese calligraphy, in using characters as design elements. It's a way for people to connect with something ancient, something meaningful, in a world that often feels very superficial.
So instead of being a threat, the digital age might actually give Chinese characters a new platform, a new way to connect with people.
Exactly. And let's not forget, millions of people use these characters every single day. That alone is a powerful force for their survival.
It's a good reminder that language isn't just about communication, it's about identity, culture, and history. And Chinese characters embody all of that beautifully.
Well said. As we wrap up our deep dive today, I hope our listeners come away with a sense of awe for this intricate writing system and its enduring legacy.
We've traveled through time, explored how language evolves, and even touched on a bit of digital calligraphy. But most importantly, I think we've uncovered some of the beauty, the ingenuity, and the cultural richness embedded in every single Chinese character.
Beautifully summarized. And for everyone listening, here's something to think about. In a world that's so focused on instant gratification and simplified language, what if the intricate beauty of Chinese characters becomes a source of fascination, a reminder of the depth and nuance that language can hold?
Now, that is a fantastic thought to leave our listeners with. Thanks for joining us for this incredible deep dive into the world of Chinese characters.